Hello, everyone. So we have a fun panel here on blockchain technology. So maybe just a show of hands. How many of the people here are actually working with blockchain technology? Okay, maybe a few percent. How many of you have heard of Bitcoin? Okay, so everybody. All right. So how many know that Bitcoin is backed by blockchain technology? Okay, most people. All right, so we're going to be talking about real-world applications and looking at blockchain technology in different industries. So what we'll start with is we're actually going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves and give a short presentation about their industry. Beena is from HPE, and she's going to be talking about the applications that she's seeing for blockchain. Radhika is going to introduce herself, and so she's going to be speaking about healthcare applications. And then Suzanne is going to be speaking from IBM about applications in food safety. But with that, each will give a deeper intro to themselves.
So, brief background, serial entrepreneur, have been involved in 2 other companies in my past, have been doing a lot of work with emerging technologies, launched a business about 6 years ago now, and roughly around the same time also invested myself very deeply in digital health. I am a digital health expert. And then about 1.5 years ago, around that time, is when I started getting interested in cryptocurrency, and by way of cryptocurrency and looking at the technology itself, got really excited about the applications in healthcare. So today I'll give you a little preview or a little insight into the different applications that we're seeing, both near term and longer term in healthcare. So if you think about healthcare in general, really the heart of all of healthcare is data. And unfortunately, in healthcare, we have a very big problem with data. It's completely fragmented, completely splintered. If you think about every single doctor, every single clinician, every single anything that you've done in healthcare, every person you've ever visited, starting from the time when your parents took you as a baby to the pediatrician, a piece of your record resides with each of those providers. You don't own any part of that, and you don't really have access to your full medical record. And so the biggest problem is how each of these providers can share that data with one another. There's no trust. You know, how do they share that? They don't. Can you have access to the full medical record? You don't usually have that. You can. It takes a while to put it all together. And if you have lived in other countries and so on, forget it. There's no way that you can potentially compile all of that. So blockchain is really pretty transformative in terms of its ability to build that trust and privacy and identity around each record. And so there's some really transformational things happening in healthcare. So really in the near-term opportunities, what we're seeing is in the areas of, if you could put the slide deck up again, we're putting a lot of emphasis now on diagnostics. You may have heard of AI as well in diagnostics. So in the area of diagnostics, it's the ability to take that person's full medical record, being able to have some sense of context to what their medical history is, so that you don't have to keep filling out those forms every time you go and see the doctor and repeating yourself over and over to every person you ever meet, and having your whole medical history on the top of your head, in your head or at your fingertips somehow. So the idea is that once you have the full context of somebody's record, that you can then, correlate that to trends that are happening in your demographic, in your age group, et cetera. If you're a woman, your gender. So gender, geography, socioeconomic status, all of these various things that play a role in how your health gets shaped, and then correlate that with your personal health and your family history, et cetera, and be able to arrive at a better diagnosis than what's currently being given. Because when doctors treat you, it's like a black box. They don't really know much about you. The other aspect that's really a real application that we're seeing is drug discovery. So pharmaceutical companies have had a real issue with counterfeiting of drugs, fake drugs. Less so in the US, for example, but the whole pharmaceutical industry worldwide is about $100 billion as far as the market size. And about 10% of that globally is plagued with counterfeiting and fake drugs. So if you think about the data that comes with blockchain and what blockchain can do, it's really providing data transparency across the continuum of what happens through the drug discovery process and the drug development process and the drug delivery process. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies getting involved in that aspect. You've got Merck and Pfizer, Genentech. A lot of them are actually doing real use cases in this area. And that it ties into the other pharma supply chain that I was talking to as well. So anytime you want to have a complete record, a continuum of an audit trail of what's happening to that record across the timeline, that's something that's really exciting in terms of what blockchain can really do. And then another area that we're seeing is virtual clinical trials. So if you know anything about healthcare and you know what companies try to do in order to be able to take that drug and bring it to market, is first of all an extremely expensive process. Multiple clinical trials that have to be done to ensure the safety of that drug before they release it to market. And in the process of virtual clinical trials, there's about a 40% attrition rate across patients that are involved in these trials, and they have to go through these interventions. And so this becomes then a hugely time-consuming and expensive process, which is why these drugs, once they're released onto the market, cost so much to us as consumers. So if you think about the power of data again and what it can do, if you think about your being able to put in your data, opt in, and get incentivized to opt in into these virtual clinical trials, the future could be where a company that is developing a drug, for example, a novel new drug, could say, I need a data set across these segments of the population, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's geography, whether it's socioeconomic status, and be able to develop much more intelligently these virtual clinical trials where people can just be looking at data, and patients themselves may not need to be actually physically participating unless there is specific interventions that are involved. So these are some of the really broad use cases that we're seeing in near-term opportunities.
Thank you, Radhika. So let's move on to a different industry.
A couple of use cases that we've seen and has really helped other than cryptocurrency is one is in the ticketing market, sporting events or any kind of events, or even artists are really frustrated with the secondary market, right? Where the tickets are sold at a higher rate, or there are add-ons that need to be done, and something like blockchain can really add value to it. So, I think it was a few months ago, Ed Sheeran actually quoted about how it's a huge challenge for artists, and I'm a huge fan of Ed Sheeran, so I remember that. But, blockchain, we actually worked with an event company where you set up a blockchain that makes it much more transparent. It gives more visibility to who is buying the ticket. If you don't want to go to that event, you can put it back into the market. You can give it back to the original ticket seller. So that was a very interesting use case. Another one that was more in the space of autonomous driving, where today a car captures terabytes of data, right? Every time you take a trip, there is several data points that get collected, and usually that data is only available to the manufacturer. Right? And they use it for very specific reasons, very good reasons, but there are several other data points that get collected which is not used. And that's like when you're driving a car, there is micro weather, the information that's being captured, the road conditions that's being captured, and those can all be used by different entities to enhance that user experience, to make help us make better decisions. So the approach we were taking was to see how do you actually enable the user, the car owner, to be able to make that data accessible to different entities by using smart contracts. And that was another very interesting use case where we were able to show that value. And now it's more about how do you take it to scale. And we'll talk about more use cases in this panel.
Thank you, Beena. Suzanne?
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Suzanne Livingston. I am the offering director for a blockchain solution that IBM has recently launched called IBM Food Trust. And just to give you a sense of what IBM's doing in the blockchain space, so Jorden mentioned Bitcoin. Bitcoin is 10 years old as of this year. It's been around for a while. And IBM Research, which is where I got my start at IBM, so we have a research division that thinks about future technologies and invests and creates new insights and drives some of our product development at the company as well. IBM Research stepped back and said a few years ago, what could we use this Bitcoin model for? And how can we improve efficiencies in how companies operate with each other? And looked at a number of areas that you could apply this blockchain technology for. One of the areas that we looked at was supply chain. So as Radhika mentioned and others have mentioned, a simple transaction can involve a lot of people sharing information and don't necessarily trust each other to share that information. So the blockchain model increases the amount of trust among the participants who are sharing data with each other. We don't need to know who each other are, we just need to know what we have to send from one party to another. And that's what Bitcoin brought to us, and we said, well, how does that apply to supply chain? When you have a supply chain, let's keep it simple. Let's say, these 4 tables here, each were different participants in a supply chain, and they were sharing goods from one to another all the way through to an end consumer. Each one of these tables has a different set of data in their organization, and it doesn't necessarily match as we go from one part of the supply chain to another. So whenever we want to have transparency or visibility across all 4, again, of these tables, we have to go to each table and ask them to share that data. Then when we see that data, we have to manually match it. That can take days, sometimes weeks. And we said, if we had all of these tables sharing that data in one system, where they trusted each other enough to share the data and could also apply their own access model to it, who that can see it and who doesn't see it, then we can reduce all of the inefficiency of having to do that manual mapping and sharing of data with each other. And that's the premise for supply chain with blockchain. We said, what industries need this problem now? And actually, one of our customers, who's been a great customer of ours for many years, Walmart, came to us and said, we need this now in food safety. And I don't even need to tell you why, right? You see the news. The latest statistic with romaine was that there were 5 deaths as a result of the romaine scare. This morning, I watched people not take melon off of the table because they were potentially concerned with what's going on right now with melon. We had eggs not too long ago. This is a real problem that has deaths associated to it. The food safety teams I work with at different companies carry around pictures of people who lost their lives as a result of food safety issues. So obviously a really compelling area, but one that needs a lot of attention. And one company can't solve it alone. A retailer can't solve the problem alone. They need to bring everybody who's part of that supply chain on board in order to make a real impact in the industry. So they're asking their suppliers, they're asking their farmers, their growers, come on board and let's collectively as an industry increase the state of food safety for everyone. So what does that mean? That means now as soon as a retailer has a recall issue or knows about a consumer issue, they can go into our blockchain system. They can search on, let's say we know the sell-by date or we know the date associated to that product. We also know the product ID. They can trace instantly all the way through to the grower, so long as everybody's sharing. And why does blockchain make everyone share? Because no one entity owns the data. It's a distributed system. We all have access to the same data. And we can, what's different than the public blockchain systems is we can actually control who sees what. So if I don't want to share my data on what I've harvested with my competitor, I don't have to. I just share with those with whom I'm a transaction partner and they see the trace. So that's the premise behind food safety and blockchain. There's other supply chain projects that IBM has going. We have a global trade system as well through a joint venture with Maersk. Same type of scenario where instead of food, it's about shipping containers and customs integration. And then there's about 400 other projects that IBM has going that are custom implementations of blockchain for specific client needs, where they've come to the table with a key problem and they're asking for help in solutioning out that problem using blockchain technology. Underneath, what I build as a solution is a set of technologies that IBM makes available for developers. So anyone here can go onto the IBM blockchain platform, and they can get educated on how to use the blockchain platform components, create your own blockchain network, start building and creating applications based on what's underneath it, the Hyperledger fabric, which is an open source implementation of blockchain that IBM also contributes to. So you can build your own blockchain network, or you can come join pre-built solutions with IBM, like IBM Food Trust and our trade solutions. So that is an overview of what we're doing with IBM and blockchain.
Thanks, Suzanne. So since many of the people here don't have a strong understanding of blockchain, I think this was really good and instructive because you were able to see that there are real-world use cases, and it's not just about Bitcoin. It's not just about all the cryptocurrencies. Industry is actually adopting. And there's a very interesting statistic that there's over 30,000 pilots that are happening in the world today with blockchain. That's about 10 times the number of cryptocurrencies that you can read about in the press. And you see this all the time. The B2C buzz, in terms of what's happening with consumers and speculation, always is much louder in the press than what's happening with inside businesses. So you've probably heard a lot about what's happening in banks and with fintech, but this panel has actually now spoken a bit about what's happening in other industries. I'd like to also just leave you with what I call the 4 pillars of blockchain and why it's so powerful. And so if you remember something about blockchain, I would say these would be the 4 things to remember. One is that it can create an ultra-secure database. And so if you think about Bitcoin again, it has an ultra-secure database that can't be hacked. It's also immutable, which means that it can't be changed. And that's why it's very important, like in healthcare and in ticket sales or in food security. So that ultra-secure database is really number 1. That doesn't change. Number 2, decentralization of transactions. So this ability also to be peer-to-peer. So with Bitcoin, I can just trade with somebody else. I don't need a bank intermediary. The same in businesses. Trading partners can trade directly with each other. They don't need an intermediary. The trust is in the network, and that's done with smart contracts. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar, which we all hear about, cryptocurrency, tokens, is really something that can incentivize different kinds of behavior. And it can gamify different kinds of systems. So that's the third pillar. And the fourth, which really hasn't happened yet, but if you remember Bitcoin, who's the company? What's the company behind Bitcoin? There's no company behind Bitcoin, right? There's Satoshi, but nobody really knows who he is, right? So you don't need a company behind a product. It just exists out there in the network, and it's run by a community. And this is kind of the most disruptive potential. But you can also, the community owns the product. So you can fork the product. So you might have heard, how many of you have heard of Bitcoin Cash? It's another kind of Bitcoin, or Bitcoin Gold, or Bitcoin Diamond. There's a lot of different Bitcoins out there because the community actually owns it. The company doesn't own the product. It's owned by the community. The community can fork the code, create a new version. So the fourth pillar is that the company is the community. So these are some pretty disruptive aspects. Obviously, that last one does not go over very well in corporate America. So don't expect to see that one anytime soon. But the other ones that we've talked about in terms of the ultra security and the decentralization of transactions are very common and are really what our esteemed panelists have been talking about. But let's shift gears and go into a quick Q&A session.
So Jorden, before you go there,
yes.
Satoshi could be a woman too, right?
Yes, and Satoshi.
Nobody knows.
There's a lot of
There's
shirts
a lot of
that you
great
might
shirts.
see from women in blockchain that say Satoshi is female.
I'm always amazed when the natural thing is to say he, but it could be a woman.
Yes, exactly. So, and it could be a group of people, it could be aliens, there could be a lot of things.
Yes.
So, but the thing is that there's no person known. Okay, so for the panel, I have a few questions. And we've kind of looked at use cases, but why will blockchain be adopted by your industry? Is it really disruptive? Is it foundational? What's so important about it for what you do?
So I'll go first. So disruptive for me means, and we all define it differently, right? So disruptive for me means when you are redoing the same process almost for cost savings or faster, for optimizing it, right? And I put AI in the disruptive bucket.
Sure.
And blockchain for me means it's foundational. It is really going to change, it's going to create new business models. It's going to change how business is done. And I think blockchain is just going to enable a whole new way of doing business. It's going to bring that connection across enterprises,
sure.
right? If you look at that first blockchain wave, it was cryptocurrency. It was more person to person. And now we're seeing more within the enterprise. And I see the next wave going to be more where, it ties in with IoT and, it's between things, people, enterprises. Everything is going to be fundamentally changed with, by leveraging blockchain.
It's going to kind of bring the whole ecosystem
Together. Yeah, that's
business.
how I see it.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Beena. Radhika.
So I'm going to disagree slightly with her. I think it's disruptive and foundational. I think foundational, yes, because everything's fundamentally transformed. We're seeing complete transformations in the way companies think about things. Whether, in healthcare, for example, the issues that I've talked about previously with data, that's been a systemic challenge through the many, many, many decades in healthcare. And that's ripe for foundational transformations. But it's also disruptive because if you look at the supply chain side, for example, or audit trail or provenance of drugs, for example, that's to bring about efficiencies and cost reductions in that process. Virtual clinical trials as well, it's bringing about efficiencies and process control and a lot of reduction in costs as well that are associated. So I think it's both. Whether healthcare adopts it or not, I think we're seeing those near-term solutions, like I mentioned, a lot in pharma. They're all over this right now. There are a lot of pilots that are exciting and coming up through that process. They're also thinking about standards. So I think, Merck, for example, is working on a project that's really more standards focused because I think there's got to be some standards around this and healthcare just loves standards. It's a regulated industry, so that's not surprising. So lots of really great near-term solutions. I think also in terms of looking at the future of what it holds for healthcare, we're seeing the marriage between blockchain and deep tech. So AI, IoT, big data, machine learning, obviously with AI. So a lot of those applications being crossed over with blockchain because if you think about AI and machine learning or even big data and analytics, again, at the heart of it is data. So if you've got imperfect data, if you've got incomplete data sets, if you've got data sets that are biased, if you've got underrepresented or unrepresented segments of populations that are not included, now what are you going to train that AI on? AI is beautiful, it's sophisticated, it can do a lot, but if you don't have the underlying data sets to support that, you're not going to be able to do much with it, or whatever you're going to come out with it is not truly representative of the population. So particularly in healthcare, we're going to see those kinds of applications coming up. So I think there is an adoption curve. We have to crawl before we walk, before we run. So I think those near-term opportunities, which are more the cost reductions and bringing efficiencies to the process, I think that's where the low-hanging fruit opportunities are. But the future is really pretty bright.
Yeah, and Radhika, I think a lot of what you said resonates with us as well because it's supply chain, right?
Exactly.
And at the heart, even though it's health and food being health too. So the way I look at what we're doing right now with Food Trust is we're focused on solving a problem that has existed for decades that hasn't been solved before. And we had to first step back and say, why hasn't this problem been solved before? So it's obviously a big issue. I don't know if anyone remembers back to 2006, but there was a spinach outbreak. Yeah. And in that spinach outbreak, 199 people actually got sick and there was a death. And that was one of the hardest hitting issues for farms and for the industry as a whole, where it really came down to one lot at one farm on one day. So the whole spinach industry took a hit. And there were farms that went out of business who had nothing to do with the contamination. And that was over 10 years ago. So what's changed since then? Not a whole lot. And I'll tell you, even before that, there obviously were many contamination issues. So what can we prevent the contamination is the first thing that I think about in terms of like truly transformative and disruptive. And how do we get to that point is data. How do we get the data that we need in order to analyze and understand the context of what's happening with the companies themselves, the environment, locations, air pollution, everything that could potentially impact an issue comes from data. And our ability to analyze that data, apply artificial intelligence to it, learn from it, will help us prevent those issues in the future. Yeah. But that's not where we are today. Right now, we're still about getting the data all collected again from the different participants of the supply chain in a way that they can trust and that they will share. So the big change for us, it's not I very rarely go to a farm and talk to them about blockchain. I talk to them about why are they going to trust the system, right? They don't care. Show me how this is going to benefit me. Exactly. Well, in the next food scare incident, if I can prove that you're innocent because you shared data and that your lot wasn't affected and your lot will still continue to be sold at the retail store, that's powerful to them. That means that it's an insurance policy for their business. So we spend a lot of time on data governance. Building a network or a group of companies sharing data is less about the technology in this regard and more about what are the rules of engagement. Who's going to share with whom? What are they going to share? How long are we going to keep that data for? It's permanent, to your point, Jorden, right? You can't edit it. You've sent it in. So now there's a record that you have contributed this content into the blockchain system. All of that is a lot of newness for many companies, and we spent almost a year working with about 12 companies on building a governance policy that I'm actually getting approval on today across these 12 companies, some of which whom you know. I mentioned Walmart already, Kroger, Driscoll's, Dole, McCormick, McLean. We have a lot of major companies who are coming on and saying, we will share data, we will share it across the supply chain if you have the right policy in place. But it's all about that foundational piece. Let's fix the problem of supply chain visibility, which hasn't been solved before. Get that right. And once we have data flowing into the system at a rate and pace that gives us enough momentum, we can then build relationships between the data that's about food and the data that's in the general World Health Organization, lots of information that's out there for us to be able to do things like predict where the next issue is, understand what are the practices that need to change in food safety in order for us to prevent these types of issues, and how to spot them faster.
If I could add one thing too, I completely agree that it's about building trust around that data. The other thing in healthcare that this is sort of the holy grail, if you will. I think the time has come when we can, as individuals, own our own records, where we don't have somebody else that has ownership of who we are and all the different dimensions. So it's not just healthcare. I like to think about it as our universal personal record. And so our universal personal identity, we might have a healthcare identity or a financial identity, a legal identity, a professional identity, a social identity. These are all dimensions. These are all aspects of just us as individuals. And I think the time has come when we can actually participate collectively across the different trusted stakeholders in the ecosystem and say who gets to see what part of our record. So what's exciting from a technology standpoint is that blockchain is also in combination with encryption techniques We talk about, on the technical side, zero knowledge proof, which means you can prove who you are without divulging aspects, the sensitive aspects of who you are. And that's pretty transformative. We've never had that kind of capability available to us. Now, is it going to get traction right away? Probably not yet. But I think the holy grail of us being able to be arbiters of our own information and choosing to selectively disclose aspects or dimensions of ourselves, I think it's here and now.
So,
can I?
Oh, sure. Beena.
Sorry, I was just going to say it reminds me of the time I think way back 30, 40 years ago, when we used to have the paper medical records, right? We all used to, our parents used to walk around with those files, of X-rays and, whatever records we had, and we chose to give it, right? And then we went through the digital era, and now with blockchain, it's almost replicating that model we had 40 years ago when we had paper records and giving access to the right doctor, but we had those physical records that we would take.
The problem is getting those physical records sometimes is problematic.
Right.
I mean, or God forbid that original physical piece of record should get tampered,
or lost,
mutilated, whatever, damaged in any way. How many of you have gone to maybe even a doctor's office and say, I'd like to get a copy of something? They go, well, can I fax it to you? I mean, we're moving around beyond all of that. It's a lot of legacy systems that we have to think about changing. But along the way comes that trust. Who do you trust that information with?
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. So what we've heard here is maybe this blockchain is kind of a trust and identity layer. And a lot of people think about it that way. So the existing internet has no trust and identity layer. That's why we have a lot of problems right now with Facebook, et cetera. People trust companies with their data, but those companies aren't always trustworthy. But we trust ourselves, at least we think we do. So if we can own the data, or the companies can own the data, then and you have a way to map the person securely to the data, then you can build trust between people. And then we have some pretty interesting ideas here for corporate America. So it's a trust layer. That sounds like a good thing. I'm sure corporate America can get behind building a trust layer. That's the foundation of business. We heard about saving money. That sounds pretty good. We heard about increasing efficiency. We heard about new business models. So those all sound like pretty good things. And so these 30,000 plus pilots kind of make sense. And we're supposed to see blockchain becoming pretty significant by the end of the year. So it looks like we have a question. So we have a few more minutes, so why don't we take your question?
I've read so much about the incredible energy consumption that's related to blockchain, or at least to Bitcoin. How are all three of you looking at energy consumption and blockchain technology?
Sure, I'll get started. We are not a public blockchain system, so we are a private and permission-based system. We don't require miners to push transactions into our blockchain or to solve complex logic. We built our own consensus algorithms to bring data into our blockchain system and bring it into our blocks. So because we are not using that part of the same model, I don't have energy consumption concerns today. We are hosting the blockchain, and we're hosting the blockchain nodes, and that is something as we grow and as we grow worldwide, we will, obviously continue to keep awareness of how much consumption our data centers and where our nodes are hosted are through, but not a concern that we have right now.
I don't know if you want to talk about proof of work versus proof of stake as well.
Yeah, so just very quickly, Bitcoin uses something called proof of work. It's, the question indicated, is very energy intensive. Most of the blockchains that are being built for business don't. They use something called BFT, Byzantine Fault Tolerance Systems, and they are not very energy intensive. So that whole issue that you hear about with public Bitcoin is not an issue at all. It's just basically using cloud-based centers, but they're going to be decentralized and distributed. Now, if you start getting tokens, and we haven't gotten to that question, and we don't have time for it, unless there are other questions. Actually, I'll just ask the question. So, how many of you think that tokens are going to become big? I mean, you don't have to use proof of work. You can use something called proof of stake. And again, this whole energy issue is really a relic, and it's probably going to disappear across the board. But how many of you think that tokens will become important in your industry? Beena?
I think that tokens are going to become big, but maybe not in the near term, because blockchain itself is so new, and we've not really proved that value. I do see a time once we reach that maturity level where tokens will become crucial.
Okay, great. Radhika?
I think there's some great models for healthcare. So I'm going to buck the trend here and say there's some tremendous opportunities for incentivizing behavior or disincentivizing behaviors in healthcare. So if you think about all of the issues that so many of us struggle with is, you go see the doctor says, you've got high blood pressure, you've got to do this, that, or the other to, improve your lifestyle, your diet, all of that, right? What if you got incentivized in a different way? I mean, many of us might wear a Fitbit or other wearable to try to give us some feedback about how we're doing on how many steps we've walked, what we've eaten, have we had enough water in the day, et cetera, have we slept well? But it's that really translating to true incentivization of behavior. What we're seeing is it's not. And so there's still the issue of how do we get incentivized to do the right things for ourselves, for our own better health. And I think that blockchain, again, as a system, because it's dependent on this incentivization, gamified behavior kind of mode of transaction, I think we've got some very unique models in healthcare where we are going to be incentivized by using tokens to maybe get access to particular services, have better insights about our data, et cetera. There's many, many different ways you can incentivize behavior, but it can be incentivizing us to do the right things and disincentivizing us to do the wrong things. So I think there's some really great token applications for that.
Thanks, Radhika. And Suzanne, our last comment, because we're out of time.
Okay. So incentives are crucial to drive behavior. We want to drive better behavior across the supply chain. Whether we do that through tokens or whether we do that through other means, I think is yet to be determined. There's some really cool ideas that have come to us from our research labs and others around using tokens. But really what we're trying to do is get people to be safe about what they're sharing, about the food that they're selling, be honest, and the more that we can incent them to do those things, apply the practices that they know are going to work and help decrease food issues across the board, we'll do anything to get people to do that, whether it's tokens or whether it's other means. It's about changing behavior at the root and making sure that everyone is protected as a result.
Well, thank you, everyone, and that was fun.
Thank you.